The abandoned town that no one dares enter. The most haunted place in America. The whispering town of Hollow Creek. There was a place in the deep, forgotten woods of the American South, nestled between the great rivers and the shadows of ancient oak trees, where no living soul dared to tread. The name of the town was Hollow Creek, a place that time had left behind, abandoned and cursed. Its streets were empty, its homes long silent, and its very air seemed thick with the stories of those who once lived there. It wasn't always that way. Hollow Creek had once been a thriving town, a small but prosperous community, carved out from the wild forests, where people had worked hard, raised families and shared their lives. The old-timers would tell you that Hollow Creek was a town full of laughter and celebration, where every evening was filled with the sound of music, children playing in the streets, and folks gathered around bonfires. The best crops were harvested there, and there was a peace that seemed untouched by time. But peace, as it often does in such places, is fleeting. The change began slowly, just like the creeping fog that rolled in from the river at dusk. At first, it was only whispers, just a few strange happenings here and there that were easily dismissed. A door left open that shouldn't have been. A light flickering in the window of an abandoned house. Some said it was the wind or perhaps a trick of the light, but the locals knew better. Those who had lived in the town long enough had heard the stories. It was said that Hollow Creek sat on cursed land, a place where the spirits of the past were restless, and the dead did not stay buried. The elders would speak of the town's earliest settlers, who had made a terrible bargain with an entity that lived beneath the earth, one whose hunger could never be sated. Some called it a spirit, others a demon, but whatever it was, it thrived on the lives of the townspeople. And once a century, when the moon was full and the winds carried the scent of ash and cedar, it would rise again. That's how it started, the first disappearance. A young man named Thomas Bennett, known for his courage and sense of adventure, had decided one late summer night to explore the old mill at the edge of the town. The mill was the oldest building in Hollow Creek, and it had always been shrouded in mystery. No one dared go near it, not since the fire many years ago, when the mill burned to the ground under strange circumstances. There were rumors that the fire had not been an accident, that the flames had been set by something, or someone, unseen. Thomas, however, did not believe in ghost stories. He was a man of reason, and he laughed off the warnings from his friends and family. Armed with nothing more than a lantern and his stubbornness, he ventured out into the woods on the eve of the harvest festival. He never came back. It was that night that the true nature of Hollow Creek began to reveal itself. The town woke up to find Thomas's lantern abandoned in the middle of the dirt road, his boots left behind, but no sign of him. Not a trace. People searched the woods, called his name, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. That was the first of many to disappear. At first, they thought it was just some terrible accident, maybe wild animals or an ill-fated slip in the creek. But as more and more people disappeared, men, women, children, the air in Hollow Creek began to change. The laughter and music that had once filled the town was replaced with hushed whispers and fearful glances. It wasn't long before the once thriving community began to crumble under the weight of its own fear. And then came the whispers. This time they weren't just in the wind but in the very walls of the town. Those who had lived in Hollow Creek for generations could hear it, faint at first, like a murmur in the distance, but growing louder with each passing night. It was the voice of the past, calling from the grave, reaching out from the darkness beneath the earth. And it wasn't long before the townsfolk began to see things, strange figures moving in the corners of their vision, fleeting shadows that darted behind the trees, flickers of light in the old homes that hadn't been lived in for years. Some said the spirits were restless. Others believed the town had angered something much darker. The whispers spoke of a ritual, one that had been performed long ago by the first settlers. They had offered up something to the entity beneath the land, a promise made in exchange for prosperity. The curse had lain dormant for generations, but now it had awakened. The entity was hungry, and the people of Hollow Creek would pay the price. As the disappearances continued, a sense of hopelessness settled over the town. No one knew how to stop the curse, no one knew how to appease the spirits, and soon, it became clear that Hollow Creek was doomed. The townspeople fled, one by one, abandoning their homes, leaving behind everything they had built. The houses stood empty, the streets grew silent, and the once thriving town became nothing more than a memory. But the curse did not die with them. No, it remained lingering in the air, waiting for anyone foolish enough to cross its path. And now Hollow Creek sat in isolation, a ghost town with no inhabitants, yet the whispers still echoed in the wind. Years passed and the town remained abandoned. But every so often there would be a traveler, a curious soul, perhaps a historian or a thrill seeker, who would wander into the woods, drawn by the tales of Hollow Creek's haunted past. They would find the town with its crumbling buildings and overgrown streets, a place forgotten by time. They would poke around, hoping for a glimpse into the town's tragic history, or perhaps searching for treasure. But what they didn't know, what no one ever told them, was that the town itself was alive. The curse of Hollow Creek was not just the whispers or the shadows, it was the land itself, watching, waiting, feeding on the souls that dared enter. And so the cycle continued, with each new traveler adding to the growing legend of Hollow Creek. But no one who ventured there ever came back. And that, my friends, is how the story of Hollow Creek has been told for generations. It is said that the curse is bound to the town's soil, to the very land that holds the forgotten bones of those who once lived there. And so the town remains abandoned but never forgotten. For those who dare to step foot in Hollow Creek, the shadows are waiting, and the whispers will never stop. The Stranger's Reckoning. It was a crisp autumn evening when a man named Elias Wright entered the forest that surrounded Hollow Creek. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone who traveled through these parts had heard of the haunted town, the place where the wind never quite stopped howling, and the trees whispered secrets to those who dared listen. But Elias was different. He wasn't a believer in ghosts or curses or spirits of the past. He was a man of science, a historian seeking the truth, eager to unravel the mysteries that others feared. He had heard the tales of Hollow Creek from an old man at the tavern, who had been too drunk to speak in complete sentences, yet still managed to pass on the legend. The story intrigued Elias. What was the truth behind this forsaken town? Was it merely superstition, or was there something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered? With a map in hand and nothing but determination in his heart, Elias ventured into the forest that night. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting long eerie shadows over the trail. He knew the way to Hollow Creek was not easy, many had gotten lost trying to find it. But he wasn't concerned. He had walked these woods before, and besides, this wasn't his first time chasing down a ghost story. As he pushed further into the wilderness, the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands trying to trap him. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The wind stirred, sending a chill through his bones, but Elias pressed on, his footsteps steady, his eyes focused on the prize. By the time he reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the town bathed in the cold light of the moon. He paused at the edge of the town, his eyes scanning the decaying buildings. There was something haunting about the sight. The broken windows, the sagging roofs, the streets overrun with weeds. But what struck him the most was the silence. There was no hum of insects, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. It was as if the very land was holding its breath. For a moment, Elias hesitated. There was a gnawing feeling at the back of his mind, a sense of being watched, but he brushed it off as nonsense. He was a man of reason after all. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He stepped into the town, the sound of his boots on the dirt road the only noise breaking the stillness. The buildings loomed over him, their hollow windows like vacant eyes, staring at him from all directions. He could almost feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on him, as though the very air held the memories of the people who had once lived here. Elias made his way to the center of town, where the old church stood, its steeple rising like a finger pointing to the heavens. It was the largest structure in Hollow Creek, its stone walls cracked and weathered with age. The door hung ajar, swaying gently in the wind as if inviting him inside. Against his better judgment, Elias stepped through the door. The interior of the church was dark, the air thick with dust. Moonlight filtered in through the broken stained glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the pews. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing. The place felt raw. There was an energy in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. As Elias moved deeper into the church, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A row of old wooden pews, each one carved with strange symbols, markings that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The symbols weren't like anything he had seen before. They were intricate, ancient, and they seemed to glow faintly as if they were alive. His fingers hovered above them, drawn to the strange designs, and as he traced one with his hand, a cold shock ran through him, like a surge of electricity. Suddenly, a voice spoke, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Leave, while you still can." Elias spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one there. But the air felt thicker now, the weight of the silence oppressive. He stepped back, his eyes darting across the room, searching for the source of the voice. But the church remained empty, save for the strange symbols and the feeling that something was about to happen. And then he saw it. At the back of the church, where the altar once stood, a figure appeared. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes dark hollows where life had once existed. His mouth was twisted into a cruel grin, but there was something wrong about the smile, something that made Elias's blood run cold. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "What is this place?" The figure took a slow step forward, its limbs creaking like dry branches. "This place is our prison and yours too now." Elias backed away, his mind racing. He had to get out of here, but his legs felt heavy, his body frozen in place. The figure stepped closer, and Elias could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone else, but the church remained empty. "There is no escape," the figure whispered. "Hollow Creek claims all who enter." Elias's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. He couldn't understand. This was just a town, a place with a dark past. Wasn't it? But as the figure's eyes locked onto his, Elias felt something deep in his gut, a feeling he had never known before. It was a sense of inevitability, as though everything had led him to this moment, this terrible realization that Hollow Creek had been waiting for him. The figure opened its mouth again, but this time no words came. Instead, a wave of cold, unnatural energy washed over Elias, and he stumbled back, gasping for air. The walls of the church seemed to close in on him, the air thickening until it was hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of the town pressing down on him, suffocating him, and in that moment he understood. Hollow Creek was alive. It had been waiting for him. And there was no way out. The price of knowledge. Elias staggered backward, his breath shallow and erratic as the figure's hollow eyes bore into him. He could feel the pulse of the town's ancient curse, thrumming through the very walls of the church, sinking into his skin, his bones. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had decided that Elias would become part of its story. The air thickened, swirling with a chilling force, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. The figure before him was no longer a man, but something darker, something ancient, its form shifting in and out of existence. A creature bound to the town, its very essence entwined with the land and the curse that had held it captive for centuries. Elias's mind raced. He had known that Hollow Creek was haunted, that something terrible had happened here, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. His rational mind screamed that it couldn't be real, that there must be some explanation, some scientific reasoning. But the dread that gripped his heart told him otherwise. The figure took another slow, deliberate step toward him, its footsteps making no sound on the rotting floorboards. Elias wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming force of the curse that seemed to seep into every pore of his being. "Why?" Elias managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" The figure's grin widened, revealing jagged, crooked teeth. "We are the forgotten. We are the ones who were offered in sacrifice in exchange for the town's prosperity. But we were betrayed, left to wither, trapped in this prison of stone and wood. And now we hunger." Elias's mind reeled as the figure's words sank in. The story of Hollow Creek's origins, the one he had been so eager to uncover, was worse than he could have ever imagined. The first settlers, desperate for success, had made a deal with the entity beneath the land, an ancient being that fed on the souls of the living, promising prosperity in return for their devotion. But the town's founders had never intended to honor their end of the bargain. Instead, they left the creature to rot in the shadows, hoping to escape its wrath. But the creature had waited, biding its time, and now it was awake. It was hungry, and it had found Elias. The figure reached out, its fingers elongated and gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. "You came seeking answers, Elias, right?" It crooned, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "But now you know too much. You cannot leave until you've paid the price." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the cold fingers brushed against his skin. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body betrayed him. The church seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, the air thick with the stench of decay. The figure loomed over him, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. In that moment, Elias understood. This was not a place for the living. Hollow Creek was a trap, a place that devoured the souls of those who dared to uncover its secrets. The people who had vanished, Thomas Bennett, the others, had become part of the town, their spirits bound to the land, forever trapped in the cycle of the curse. You can't keep me here," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "I will find a way out." The figure's grin twisted into something more sinister. "You are already too late. The town has already claimed you. You will never leave, Elias. You are one of us now." Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet seemed to give way, and Elias felt himself falling, plunging into the darkness below. His body hit the cold earth with a sickening thud, and for a moment all was still. The only sound was the soft, mournful whisper of the wind as it swept through the trees, carrying with it the voices of those who had been consumed by Hollow Creek. When Elias opened his eyes, he found himself in a vast, desolate landscape, a place that seemed to exist outside of time, where the earth was barren and the sky was a swirling mass of clouds. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and in the distance, he could see the shadows of figures moving, their forms twisted and grotesque, like the remnants of those who had lived in Hollow Creek. He tried to move, to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He was no longer in the church, no longer in the town. He had crossed over into a realm of forgotten souls, a place where the cursed lingered, trapped in an eternal prison of their own making. As he stood there, overwhelmed by the weight of the curse, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice that sounded like the one he had heard in the church, but now it was everywhere, swirling around him, filling his thoughts. "You are one of us now," the voice whispered. "Your soul is ours, bound to this place. You will never escape." Elias fell to his knees, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He had come seeking knowledge, seeking the truth, but now he understood that some truths were better left buried. Some stories were not meant to be told. The ground beneath him began to crack, and from the fissures, a dark mist began to rise, swirling around him like the fingers of the past, pulling him down into the earth. The figures in the distance began to approach, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes hollow and empty. They were the lost souls of Hollow Creek, forever bound to the land, forever cursed. As the mist enveloped him, Elias felt the weight of their suffering, their anger, their hunger. He had uncovered the truth, but it was a truth that had cost him everything. Hollow Creek had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. And now, Elias Wright was part of the legend. Another name whispered in the wind, another soul lost to the cursed town. The town of Hollow Creek remained, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in, to uncover its secrets and to pay the price for knowledge. And the whispers would never stop.